Good evening to the webinar participants from India and a very good morning to those who are joining us from USA. I am Ashok Misra. I'm the president of the IIT Alumni Center, Bengaluru, which we established a few years ago. And we are building a unique center of its kind with our own bricks and mortar building, which is about 2/3 ready. And we hit a roadblock because of COVID-19. But if everything goes well, we should be operational in our own building starting next year. This unique center is to facilitate the interaction between the IITs and the industries, to get projects from the industries for the IITs, and also to organize workshops which are of industry's interest. In addition, of course, we will have networking between alumni of the various IITs. We are very proud to say that 16 IITs have already joined us as partners in our unique venture of the IIT Alumni Center, Bengaluru, IITACB for short. Recently, we held the first ever IIT Industry Conclave in Bengaluru. It was a very successful event with a lot of excellent recommendations that came. However, the follow-up has been slow again due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but we are moving forward, but slowly. Due to this COVID lockdowns, we thought of some new things to do, so we launched the webinar series on topical subjects, and they've been very, very successful. Registrations peaking at 1,000 and above for one of them. Routinely, we have more than 500 registrations. Today's webinar is the 10th in the series, and it also marks the first webinar with a speaker from USA, Mr. Parag Saxena. Before I introduce him, let me talk a little bit about housekeeping. Please put your comments in the chat box and questions in the Q&A box. Questions which go to the chat box will not be answered. So please, and also your questions, please make them brief and crisp so that we can answer them properly. It's my pleasure to introduce Parag Saxena, whom I've known for about 20 years. He started as a chemical engineer at IIT Bombay, after which he went to the US for his master's, and that followed by an MBA from Wharton. I first met him in New York when he hosted a meeting of the IIT alumni at his home. And this was very soon after I took over as the director. He has been a great supporter of his alma mater, IIT Bombay in this case. He later built his investment career from Citibank, and in 35 odd years that he has been in the venture capital and private equity space, betting on early companies like Starbucks, Amazon, and has been on the Forbes Midas list for top investors multiple times. The companies his firm led investments in are today worth over $500 billion and employ hundreds and thousands of people. So he's obviously contributed greatly to the economy. He is a very caring human being, willing to help anyone who asks for it at all times. Great attributes of his is that he is equally at ease with world leaders, as well as with aspiring school kids from distant rural neighborhoods. His cultural coefficient, a prerequisite for leadership, is amongst the top percentile. Aside of all this, he is a lover of Shakespeare, watches tennis very, very much, and pursues yoga with the same passion as bridge and cricket. He has been a mentor to many alumni and young entrepreneurs. He handholds them till they can run on their own. A great support for startups. He's a strong supporter of both arts and sciences. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Jayesh Bellare. also a chemical engineer. So by coincidence, Parag, Jayesh, and myself, all three of us are chemical engineers. So you'll see what we can do. He's a institute chair professor at IIT Bombay, also an alumnus of IIT Bombay. He's a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, India, and the Indian National Academy of Engineering, and the Electron Microscopy Society, amongst many others. His expertise is in cryo-electron microscopy, nanomedicine, biomedical devices, and implants for regenerative medicine. He has won numerous awards, including the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Government of India, Ministry of Ayush, the President's Award for Electron Microscopy Society of America, and the ICI Award of the Most Outstanding Chemical Engineer by the Indian Institute of Chemical Engineers, and the Nasi Reliance Award for Application Oriented Research. He'll be moderating the session today, which will be on the lines of a fireside chat with, of course, some presentations and so on. So with this, let me kick off the proceedings by asking Parag to tell us about your background and your professional journey, which has taken you from chemical engineering of IIT Bombay to where you are today. With this, I hand over the proceedings to Parag and Jayesh will conduct it from here.
Ashok, thank you for that wonderful and warm introduction. My mother could not have done a better job. Uh, but let me get to my background. So like many people, I think on this call, I am an alumni of IIT, as you said. I went to IIT Bombay, and I put together a few slides. Is the slide visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. So my education came to me from three places. The first, the most important, was from IIT. IIT Bombayites will recognize the main building. And I went from there to West Virginia. I'm often asked why I chose West Virginia. It was a combination of being able to afford it. They offered me an assistantship, and that was enough for me. It was also the shortest program. My real interest was an MBA. And here I could get my MS done in just 2 semesters, since my real objective was the MBA later. And then I worked for a little while, which I'll tell you about in a second, and then moved on to...
Parag, can you make it full screen?
Yeah, thank you. And then I moved on to Wharton, as Ashok said, where I did my MBA. So to tell you a little bit about my work experience, the crucial milestones in my career were when I finished my MS from West Virginia. I looked for a job as a chemical engineer. And one of the opportunities that I had was to work for Becton Dickinson. If you don't know Becton Dickinson, they are the world's leader in making needles and syringes. They have more than 85% of the world share. They also invented the vacutainer and had the patent to it and dominate the world in that. The vacutainer actually was a brilliant piece of engineering design, and it's the product I worked on and contributed to. I don't know if you can see in these tubes, there is a residue at the bottom of these tubes. And when I joined Becton Dickinson, one of the big challenges they were having was in separating red blood cells from plasma. For all the most popular tests that are done, the most frequent tests that are done, and I'm sure everyone on this webinar here today has had their blood drawn and a test done. The most common tests are those that measure, for example, glucose, cholesterol, sodium, and so on. And to do that, we need plasma separated from red blood cells. So blood is drawn into one of these tubes, and Becton's first brilliant part of this was to switch from the syringe before this blood was drawn by a syringe, so that there could be a little bit of error by the phlebotomist who drew the blood. And then, depending upon what the purpose of the test was, different reagents were mixed into it. Another source of potential error, because you had to get a precise measurement of the reagent. So here what happened was that they did a vacuum. So a precise amount of blood was drawn into the tube. The reagent was pre-done. And then the part that I contributed to, the residue that I want to talk about here, is this residue was designed so that its specific gravity is between red blood cells and plasma. It is a jelly at the bottom of the tube in the beginning, but when you have centrifugal force, and all these tubes are put into a centrifuge after the blood is drawn to separate the red blood cells from the plasma. So they are spun in a centrifuge. And so the red blood cells go to the bottom, and because the specific gravity of this gel is between those two, it forms an impenetrable barrier which resumes its jelly at the end. Beautiful, elegant solution. Over 2 billion tests like this are sold today. So the wonderful thing for me was my home paper, and if that is only an IIT Bombay term, that is the glorified BTech thesis that we had, was on the rheology of non-Newtonian fluids. It was precisely designed to be able to help in the design of this gel. And it was a very, very satisfying thing for somebody at the beginning of their career. What that did for me, though, was it got me into the field. And I went and visited hospital after hospital that was adopting this new tube. It replaced the solutions that existed before it. And I got a picture of healthcare. I got a picture of how and why people buy one product versus another, what their problems are in the lab, the mess that occurs when one of these tubes breaks inside a centrifuge, and the recurring problems. It gave me a real perspective and an interest in the broader scheme of healthcare at a very, very micro level. It also gave me a great view of the United States in visiting hospitals. Over the 3 years that I worked for Becton Dickinson, I visited 46 of the 50 American states, more than most of my American colleagues. So I came away from BD with a knowledge and a love for healthcare, which stays with me to this day. I went to business school, as I said. I joined a consulting firm briefly, but then the real change in my life was when I joined Citicorp, which had offered me a job at the end of my MBA, but not one that I wanted. I wanted one in venture capital, and they were starting a venture capital unit, and I started it as the low man on the totem pole, the junior most person, but probably the most excited and happy person in the team because it is what I wanted to do. That was in May 1983. Uh, so I joined Citi, and then I had a bit of mixed luck. Mixed luck being that the person who had recruited me left in September that year, and all of a sudden I didn't know if I had a future there or not, and whether in fact I could pursue a venture capital career or not. But I had one very prized possession. I had a calling card which said Citicorp, which was a global famous name at the time. Citi was the dominant commercial bank, well known around the world, and it was a great calling card. It enabled me to raise my first fund, the grand sum of $13 million. But then luck favored me and it did extremely well. And so I continued with that in a career that eventually, with other steps along the way, but I think they're less important, I started my own firms. The unusual thing of starting two firms, one focused on the Indian subcontinent, New Route, and the other, Vedanta Capital, which is from where we do a lot of the healthcare companies that I hope we will cover today. I said that healthcare was, something that I liked from the beginning, and I had the pleasure, the privilege of personally leading most of all the investments. And I say this because these investments were all done by my firm, not by me personally. And they were always done as a team. In fact, everything I have done in my life has depended upon a team around me. And I say that because it's important to remember that. It's important to remember that individually we may think we do it all, but it's really the team. These slides that you see, we started building them yesterday morning, and if it wasn't for the team of 4 or 5 people around me, they wouldn't be here this morning, because I certainly couldn't have put them together in the few hours that we did. So amongst the only early investments that we had, and I point to this for a reason, was Amgen. Amgen today is the world's largest biotechnology company. I learned a great deal from George Rathman, who was its founder. George was a unique person who started 3 companies, each of which was worth well over $1 billion over a period of time. Amgen today is worth over $200 billion. And George was its chairman and CEO, George Rathman. And I learned a tremendous amount from him. But I also pursued the love of healthcare with companies like that. And a few years later, Celgene, which recently Bristol Myers bought, paying $74 billion for it. And again, it was a clever idea. Celgene, early on in the early 80s, made the discovery, which we learn in chemistry, perhaps as high school students today. I learned it at IIT, that optical isomers can have very different behavior. And they found a drug which was extremely dangerous as one isomer, but the other isomer has a great application in cancer and is actually a multi-billion-dollar drug today in cancer. And that was the first thing that Celgene, the first product that Celgene brought to the market. We led the sole investment in that company, the only people that had the courage to put up the money when they needed it badly. I invested in Celgene twice, once in 1986, the second time in 1997, when we were the only investor. I put up Oncotype here because I was thinking about how Oncotype came much later. So this is well after recombinant DNA had established itself. But you're all familiar with PCR. And Oncotype was a clever idea that built on that, but their brilliant innovation was a different insight. What Oncotype does, their first test, they have many now, but their first test tells a woman who has already had breast cancer whether or not she should go in for chemotherapy. It is both an expensive and a painful decision, because chemotherapy is a many-month process that is going to remove all the hair from your head, is going to leave you vomiting, uncomfortable, unhappy, should you have it or not. Protocol at that time, which seemed extremely logical, was that if the woman was of greater than a certain age, doctors believed, the oncologists believed, that she would probably die from something else. So there was no point putting her through a course of chemotherapy. So what they did was, they didn't give chemotherapy to those patients. Also, if the node was bigger than a certain size, they gave chemotherapy. If it was smaller, they didn't. In a clinical study that Oncotype did, they showed that throwing darts was better than this completely logical sounding supposition. The importance of data was established brilliantly by this. The other great innovation, which I love, that Oncotype had, was to prove that its test was effective to the FDA. What they had to do was to show that a woman didn't get cancer 10, 15, 20 years later. How do you show that you don't get cancer? Do you do a test and wait for 20 years? That's one way to do it, but that would take a long time. They came up with a brilliant alternative. The National Institute of Health stores samples and stores them in formaldehyde. They went back and looked at samples that were more than 20 years old and discovered a way to recover DNA even though the sample had been in formaldehyde. This was a challenge, and it was generally accepted that you can't do it before this company, Genomic Health, figured out how to do it. They then took these greater than 20-year sample and said to the FDA, we will predict blind, give us the samples blind. We will tell you which people went on to have cancer. And they proved that with a 99.9% confidence ratio statistically, so that they showed that the test was effective. So it's a wonderful insight using technology, but also using the system. And I say that because it's a combination of technology, but also understanding the real world and making solutions work within it. As Ashok mentioned, we had as a firm the privilege of being an early investor in Starbucks. When I met Howard Schultz, he said, we'll never have more than a dozen stores. This is an apprentice business. We all know now Starbucks today has tens of thousands, 24,000 stores. It's in 76 countries. When we met this company, the bet, the challenge was whether or not people who drank coffee and paid $3 for it in the state of Washington and the city of Vancouver in Canada, the only two locations that Starbucks existed then. Was this a phenomena that existed there? Or was this a phenomena that would be able to come everywhere? Would we all love espresso? Today we know we all do, right? In India, we go to the coffee day nearby or something like that, Gloria Jeans, whatever, coffee, tea, or me. So at that time, we didn't know this. In the late 80s, it wasn't clear that this phenomena would capture consumer behavior. Similarly, would people shop at Costco? When we invested, there was one store. Today, there's hundreds of these stores, 785 at the time that we found the data for this. Or Metro PCS, which was a pioneer they said people would make many more phone calls and would buy our service, even though there are many other competitors out there. We have a different model, and Metro PCS came up with this model of providing unlimited bandwidth, unlimited roaming for a fixed fee. They figured that people would be attracted to that model, and there was a large enough number of them. So it wasn't a technological breakthrough, but it was understanding consumer behavior and switching to that. And Metro PCS today is a company with order of magnitude $100 billion value in its current avatar, which is as T-Mobile. And parlayed that brilliant idea with many adventures along the way over a 20-year period to a leader globally. I think I'll stop there on the things that affected my background.
Yeah, very good, Parag. Thank you for that insight. It's obvious that you have had really a very impactful investment profile and being able to pick up the right things. But and it's obvious that your entire career really has been devoted to funding and nurturing and assisting innovation. So, at a broader sense, can you share with us what really is the key that drives innovation and your identification of those?
So in my experience, the way I would summarize that is that all of innovation is driven by three really important changes. There are lots of things that happen, but the three things that accelerated the most are changes in regulation. Because regulation is very powerful, and when regulation changes, it spawns a whole stream of innovation. People come up with ideas to benefit from that regulation, which can be deregulation or can be regulation that tries to push something. It can be either one of them, right? The second thing is changes in technology, which we are familiar with. And I think the one that most people think that technology is the biggest driver. But in fact, regulation is huge. And I'll give you some examples of each of those two. And then the third thing, which is normally the slowest driver of change, is changes in consumer behavior. For people to adopt the Metro PCS model took 10 years. For Metro PCS to take away share from the leaders, AT&T and Verizon, took 10 years. For Starbucks to convert people to buying $3 espressos instead of 50-cent coffees from the corner store also took years. And so the consumer behavior is the slowest to change normally. But circumstances change, and that's the wonderful thing about the investment business. You keep learning. I have learned greatly in the last few months, and I will come back and share that with you. Whoops.
All right.
I said that regulatory change, right? So for a long time, Alexander Graham Bell's company, AT&T, you would see its symbol out there. The great genius created a great company and created a great research organization, Bell Labs. I'm sure there are people on this webinar who have actually worked at Bell Labs. And so he created that, and Bell stayed as a near monopoly. They had to satisfy certain demands that the government had, which was to provide service. So even if there was a person a mile away from any switch box, 5 miles away from any switch box, they had to get service, and AT&T had to provide that. But that gave them a monopoly for a long period of time. And then the government decided that they would break that monopoly. Some companies had already started finding little loopholes at the edges, at the margin of regulation in the United States. And then the Telecommunications Act of 1996 did a great deal of deregulation. So till then, we had the familiar phone that those of us who are over 50 years of age will definitely recognize as the only phone that they knew for most of their lives before it changed widely, the Bakelite phone that you see here. But the Telecom Act of 1996 changed two things. It enabled new people to come in and manufacture both instrumentation as well as the switches, the equipment that goes behind this, and also deregulated services so that it permitted new people to come into services. And that reverberation went all over the world. So you see it not only in India, but you see it all over the world. So it spun off a number of companies in the US, but it also spun off. So I was watching with interest, as I'm sure all of you were, as Reliance Jio raised the staggering sum of $10 billion in a month during COVID. So it was an astonishing thing that they were able to do at this point in time. It goes back to the deregulation that started in the States. People said, hey, this works. And in fact, the consumer benefits, and governments around the world started to permit non-government or non-monopoly organizations to do it. I said that technology is the other thing that drives innovation. I have several examples. Shockley and two of his colleagues came up with the transistor in 1947 as all of us know. He won the Nobel Prize for that in 1956. And the first major company, there were others like National Semiconductor, the first major company that came out of that was Intel Corporation, which was founded in 1968. And here was a company that was going to make ICs by the million, today by the billion. It spawned other deep foundry manufacturers who said, hey, we can take this to a different level of mass production. And now, of course, the use of the IC is completely ubiquitous. It is there everywhere. We don't even think about where it is. Uh, the two symbols I used here, one which will be familiar to all, of course, is the mobile phone, and perhaps less familiar, but a clear example of what we've gone what this has taken us to is the Tesla car, right? Which is really another long-term outgrowth of that growth. But the thing to take away from here is that 1947, so 20 years later, 1968, you started to see the use of ICs in a huge fashion. 20 years to go from a science breakthrough, the discovery of the transistor, to the mass production and the use where every one of us in some way was starting to use ICs in the first way. I saw as a clever cartoon recently that if the safety pin was invented today, it would probably have two ICs in it. Other technology breakthroughs and those in the area that I work on in particular, right? Paul Berg in 1971 published the first paper on DNA splicing. He came up with this brilliant idea that I can take the DNA from mammal A or sorry, living thing A and put it into species B. If I can get species B to multiply rapidly, I will produce the product from species A quickly. And this idea is an idea that is used multiply today. Gene splicing, the idea that then became popularized, Coyer and Bohan at Stanford, then after the UCSF breakthroughs, then popularized that idea. Berg won the Nobel Prize in 1980 for his brilliant breakthrough. And then just 5 years after he won the Nobel Prize, or 14 years from the time of the science breakthrough, 14 years from 1971, you saw the first approval of a drug, Genentech, one of the major companies, which is now part of Hoffmann La Roche. Hoffmann La Roche paid nearly $100 billion for this company, created the first product from recombinant DNA. Just a few years later, 2019, today, over $500 billion of revenues come from recombinant DNA. So stop and think about that. A science breakthrough in 71, the first product in 85, so 14 years later. And then in 3 decades, you're seeing a business that is $500 billion, which will quickly cross $1 trillion in value. So technology is clearly a huge driver of innovation. Another innovation, which I think we will see a huge amount, Sidney Kohler and Cesar Milstein from Cambridge created monoclonal antibodies, found a way to uniquely attach one antibody to something, which people then parlayed into different kinds of tests. The first really popular test that occurred from this in the early 80s was a test for pregnancy, which you could just use urine to figure out whether or not you were pregnant. So it was an extremely convenient test. Today, that same idea is used across a large number of diseases. And one of the goals for people in COVID is to try and find a test that works off a monoclonal antibody so that you could do something very, very simply. And when that breakthrough comes through, that's my hope here on this slide, that in 2021 perhaps, we will have a quick test for COVID. Vaccines, thinking of COVID, is the other place where technology is huge in this area, so that what began as an idea in 1796 with Jenner with vaccines, he injected a small 12-year-old boy. The FDA, anywhere in the world today, would strongly forbid something like that. But he took some residue from a smallpox infection that a milkmaid had, put it on a little kid. I think many of us know the story, and put it on kids. And that eventually led to the first vaccine in 1921, which was the BCG vaccine. So that all the scourges that occurred in the prior century, rabies, cholera, tetanus, typhoid, the plague, many of these no longer occur, because now every 3 years or so, we have a new vaccine. So that today we have 50 new vaccines for diseases. And we are desperately looking for one for COVID. And I hope that in 2021, we will have one for COVID. So regulation drives innovation, technology drives innovation. I used a few examples there. And the third thing is that consumer behavior, but this is normally the slowest driver of change. In consumer behavior, you first had the ancient marketplaces, the agoras in Greece, and they go back to 800 BC. That's where trading occurred. And then we had mom and pop shops, and then Harrods in 1826. The first Harrods store was created, and we all know of it. And then department stores, the concept was created. And then we started to optimize that. And Walmart came up with the idea of having huge choice, huge volume, but really low prices. Costco adopted a format of that, made you a member of it. And then the big box revolution expanded, so that in different ways, Starbucks was a form of that. Amazon takes another axis to that and provides you with convenience. But this was basically taking consumer behavior and giving you cost and convenience as the two axes. But again, this is not something you do quickly. Even today, Kirana stores or corner stores or the bodega here exist because our behavior hasn't completely gone away, and we don't do all our shopping. So it's something that happens and takes a period of time. Consumer behavior changes are the slowest, but those are the three drivers: regulation, technology, consumer behavior.
So, Parag, can I ask you a question related to what you just said? The changes in consumer behavior are often post facto, so to speak. Yeah. But
Yeah.
you, as investor or an innovator, have to anticipate those. So, taking examples that you mentioned, such as Starbucks and Costco, how did you really get the insight into the changes or the expectation of consumer behavior before perhaps even the consumer knew about it?
So in the end, this is always a gamble. But it's a probabilistic gamble, right? And so like most things that we have to do where we are taking some element of risk, right? So I think all of us know the story that when the first test of the atomic bomb went off, all the scientists working on the Manhattan Project weren't absolutely sure if they would destroy Earth in that process, right? So they were taking a gamble, even though it was a very, very thought out experiment by the smartest physicists on the planet, right? So the same thing in a much less dramatic, much less important way is what we do, right? So when we looked at Starbucks, for us, it was terrific coffee. It was wonderfully served. The risk was this something that the climate of the Pacific Northwest, which is a rainy climate, gloomy most days, was that something that would translate to the rest of the country? Would convenience and cost be important enough to people, right? So these are the important things in the consumer world. These are the important things. Of course, sometimes they are thrust upon us. You can, and we do, and there are very good surveys that you can do. You can actually take groups of people, you can model those people so that they are a microcosm of society. There are even cities that people think of as the model city, so that you will see that people that start new products, when you see a Hindustan Lever or a Procter and Gamble start a new product, you will find that they won't start it in the biggest market. They won't begin with New York City. They won't begin with Mumbai. They will begin with a small place which they view as a model, because they have learned that through sophisticated marketing. In the venture world, you do the same thing, right? And so one important thing I want to say this to entrepreneurs, potential entrepreneurs who are out there: always take data. It is very easy to believe that the idea that you have must be one that everyone believes. But I learned early in my career that my own instinct was often wrong, and that it was really important to get data from others, and ideally data from people who were not like me, people who didn't think like me, people who didn't have my background. So in fact, I was in a company recently, and I was looking around at the people, and I said, you know what's wrong with this? We're all engineers here. Because when you're all engineers, you have a certain perspective, and that is not the world. And so you need to design your surveys with people that represent the audience that you're eventually going to go after. And you need to ask those questions and be guided by that data. But in the end, you're always going to take a gamble. Now, I don't want to take away, and I know that there are some naysayers, I don't want to take away from the people who believe that they have an idea and the world just hasn't understood it yet. Yes, there are people, but I think those are people who are 1 in 100 million, maybe 1 in 1 billion. When you have somebody like a Steve Jobs or a Mark Zuckerberg completely convinced that their model is something that everybody needs, even though it is generally a leap from what was there before, that is a hard model to follow. You should believe that you're going to be as good at cricket as Sachin Tendulkar or Virat Kohli before you believe that your belief is going to capture the idea and have as many followers.
Okay,
Jayesh,
great. I think that's a great answer. I hope there are some more Steve Jobs amongst us, but I think you have to take the consumer voice of the consumer with enough interest and with enough weightage. So Parag, you've talked to us about a few healthcare related investments that you have made and promoted. Can you give us some more examples or some more insights into the healthcare scenario? Let's limit this first to the pre-COVID. We'll get to COVID in a moment. But in the pre-COVID era, and then perhaps after COVID dies out and the new normal sets in, we can talk about that later. But in the pre-COVID era, what has been your feelings about the healthcare, and what are your views on that?
so for some time now, one of the things I felt is that there are two major problems with healthcare globally. One problem is access. Everybody does not have equal access to good quality healthcare. And that's one issue. The second issue is that we have a huge technological set of breakthroughs, which I talked about earlier today, the uh, analysis of the human genome, the available of data science, and the combination of those things leads you to something that you say, hey, listen, we need to rethink healthcare. And for those that do not have access, data science provides a huge step forward, because there's a great deal that we can do with data science. And where we can do it, of course, is wellness. I think we all instinctively, those of us who are educated, instinctively know that wellness is the way to go. Prevention is the way to go, right? So, not having diabetes type 2 is the best way to never have diabetes type 2, because diabetes type 2 is a lifestyle disease. We bring it on ourselves because we don't eat properly. We bring it on ourselves because we take too much stress on. We bring it on ourselves because we don't treat high blood pressure, we don't exercise, right? We know all these things and we know them to a greater extent. My children are much more thoughtful about exercising than I am. My children are much more thoughtful about eating carbohydrates or not eating carbohydrates than I am. So that's one thing. There's that awareness that we have. And so pre COVID, wellness is something that is extremely important, but it's still at the periphery. It is still with the more educated, with the early adopters. It is not something that everyone believes. But there is an opportunity using data science to convince everybody. Given the growth in less expensive telephones and our ability to distribute these cellular telephones everywhere, we can provide knowledge to people that don't have it. Because the challenge for somebody who's diabetic, the next step for someone who knows that they shouldn't have carbohydrates is, okay, tell me what I can eat. It's not enough for me to know that I shouldn't eat what I call the white devils, white flour, white rice, sugar. But I need to know what I can eat instead. It needs to be easily available, it needs to be inexpensively available. And so that is something that we can do. And nutrition is a concept that we can provide. And particularly where money is scarce in the developing world, the idea of promoting wellness is the way to go, and data science is the way to use it. And by data science, I mean, when we see somebody not following that, when we see somebody that has a high salt diet and has hypertension, reminding that person to not have things which have salt, and telling them that when you have a spoonful of pickle, you are eating 2 days of salt probably, will educate them so that they will pause before they have that spoon of cigarette. That's the opportunity before us. For the wealthier world, prices still have to come down. There is biomedicine, where genomic sequencing will lead us to more sophisticated, very precision medicine driven solutions for individuals, but costs still have to come down. Today, that is still more for the rich world. But just as a point of interest, I will tell you, my firm, Vedanta, we are building one of the largest biobanks in the world in India, with the idea of treating diseases in India much less expensively than we are doing today, as we get a genetic profile of more and more people and are able to find aberrations in their genomic profile that create diseases, right? So for example, in 150 million hilly tribe people, we have a materially different mix of blood related diseases like thalassemia, sickle cell anemia, absence of factor 8, and so on. And so we're able to do that. And uh, over time, this cost will come down from where it's already come down a lot. The first genome cost $3 million to do. Of course, that was a sample of one. Today, we can do it for about $600. But I think that the cost has to come down to something like $10 before it becomes a mass usable thing. And that's the vision, I think, for healthcare. You've got to use the availability, the vast availability of data and the ability to process it to provide digital health solutions for access to health. And that will create wellness, which reduces the need to take care of people. We don't really today have a healthcare system We have a sick care system. We need to change it, and we need to change our mindset to a healthcare system.
So, Parag, associated with that, we know that you are a yoga enthusiast, amongst other things. So, do you the somewhat touchy subject occasionally of looking at traditional and alternative systems of medicine within the healthcare system? Do you have any views on that?
So I think, and in fact, I've been working on a project where in the scheme of wellness, right, there are many things that we know, right? And there are some things that we know growing up in India, which today have been scientifically proven, right? We have clinically proven using double-blinded samples with things such as, I'll give you two very common examples that everybody in India knows and we see globally, which is the isolation of the active gene from neem. We know that neem seems to have something because insects don't attack trees, which are helped by neem, right? And we use neem to brush our teeth. And we seem to be able to keep bacteria away from our mouths by doing that. Similarly, we know that from haldi, turmeric, there is something in there, turns out it's curcumin, there is something in there which prevents inflammation. And again, that is something now which is widely proven, and the use of turmeric has become very broad. So I'm always amused when I go to a coffee shop and I see that one of the things I can add is a shot of a little bit of haldi or turmeric into my coffee or whatever it is, right? I have it in my meals all the time. So I think that, we have in the system of Ayurveda, we have that in the system of yoga, we have that one that, if you can think about right now, in yoga, in the end, breathing is the most important thing. Pranayam is the most important thing in the end, and our ability to breathe. And sadly, as we know, in COVID, we finally die from pulmonary fibrosis. We finally die from the inability to breathe. It feels as if every breath that we are taking is coming through a vast body of water every breath, and then we can't do it anymore, right? Ventilators can't support us.
Sure.
But breathing and yoga supports that. And if we were to build these things in, I think we would build wellness in extremely well.
Thank you, Parag. So that leads into the million or billion dollar question of the current circumstances. And how has the current COVID pandemic affected things, and what's your prediction for the post-COVID scenario?
So I think, the two things that happen, the obvious things that happen with COVID are that digital health accelerates, and what used to be a corner case, what used to be something that we tried because it wasn't ideal, now becomes massively usable, and there's a large number of people that will continue to use behavior, right? So digital health, particularly in the use of virtual health applications such as doctor visits, which can be done. So just to give you a statistic that I saw in a McKinsey report in the last couple of days, 76% of doctor visits during COVID have been done virtually, right? So that probably tells us what can be done. 3/4 of all cases don't really need people to go there, and don't need people to physically meet a doctor, because they've been able to find a way to do that. In India, in Bangalore actually, we have a company called DocsApp, which is also a pioneer in the telehealth space and has done this. But what I think we will find is that many, many more things. I know of companies that are working on doing your eye exam through your telephone, so that your doctor can do your eye exam, removing another need for you to go to an optometrist or ophthalmologist, and you can do this on your own. So I think that will accelerate. But the impact of COVID goes far beyond this, because COVID is going to change behavior in many, many ways. Uh, uh, I'll pause here for a second. This is a little bit like for people in the IT industry in the year 2000, there was this huge fear that when we changed in the year 2000, a lot of computer programs would run awry. And there was a huge burst of conversions that took place and a huge amount of business that firms like Azim Premji's firm and uh, Infosys and TCS and so on all had, right? So today, I think COVID-19 is going to be the reason why there is digital transformation that takes place. Because what COVID has done is it has taken us at a very rapid speed. And all of a sudden, we've gone from having, in the pre-COVID, people that would do telehealth were the early adopters, were the visionaries, and the providers of the technology were those that were providing game-changing technology, right? And when you went to make a sale to this hospital, what you had to show them was, and what you had to come away with was the hospital or the doctor said, yes, I believe what you believe, but it was a difficult sell, right? During COVID, all of a sudden, it has changed. Hospitals now say, we need the solution that you have. Do you have a digital health solution for me? I need that solution today. So what's going to happen post-COVID is what used to be your early adopter, people at the fringe, the people that bought the first thing and everything, will now become mainstream customers, because during COVID, they have been forced to do a variety of things, right? So that business will transform completely, right? I think about how many people in my office really need to travel as much as they traveled before. I myself was on a plane 2 days a week, 3 days a week, going somewhere to meet somebody. Now I think there are many of those meetings that I can cut out and I can just do them over video conference as we are doing this webinar here today. And indeed, every day I probably do 3-4 meetings using one of the various video conference services. So I think that behavior will change completely, which means that other things have to happen. So for example, on Thursday mornings, I do a form of yoga with a teacher who happens to be in Spain. And I do it with one other person who takes the class with me, a former general in the Indian Army who lives in Pune. And so it's the three of us, the teacher, the general, me. And so we do it over Zoom. And I use my computer to blow up the image on a large TV screen so that I can see myself on that easily and see my teacher. And I notice the lag between the Bluetooth image from my computer to the TV screen. So it tells me that that has to get a lot better. And so we know the obvious ones. Security, everything in computer security has to get better if we are going to use conferencing much more. Zoom had many failures, for example, that we are familiar with, right? So security, so that is a much bigger transformation than just healthcare. But within healthcare, we're going to see this. I saw an estimate recently by somebody that said $2.3 trillion will be spent on the changes of making things available that we realized because of COVID we need to have done, right? And that deals with communication, that most basic need, with the security of being able to make it happen, with the payment process that we have, with the forces that now will change education. Because as we think about this, IITs, colleges, schools, how much more will be forced online and for how long? Because I don't think COVID is going to go away tomorrow. I think that it is here. in this current form for at least one more year from today before we have the three things that we need. We need a quick, inexpensive test. We need several drugs that work, or several vaccines that can take care of the population inexpensively. But that transformation now has started, and post COVID, you're going to have a lot of applications that you didn't have before this.
So, what's you would hazard a guess on a timeline for those solutions? The ones relating to COVID, of course.
Yes. So I think that, around the globe, people are rapidly doing that. I'm sure that people are thinking about solutions to these various problems, and we are going to start seeing them in months. I'm talking about the solutions to communication issues, improving those, to security issues, to improving those, to things I haven't thought about at all, improving those, to providing education, right? So companies like uh, the inefficiencies that are highlighted, whether in healthcare, whether to enable you to work from home, whether to make supply chains more resilient. COVID has highlighted each of those, right? So Coursera, many people here may have taken a course from Coursera, but viewed it as a kind of a curious, an interesting curiosity. Coursera has been around for many years, but now COVID has accelerated Coursera so that all of a sudden Coursera becomes a viable thing. And I expect that what they will be looking at and saying is, what more can we offer, right? And I just use Coursera as an example that many people know, but there are many other services that provide classes online. So this will get accelerated through COVID. These are things that are happening. These are ideas that we must come up with just now, right? So our own version in India, we've adopted Arogya Setu, the bridge to health. That must get accelerated, must be used for many more things. It cannot stop at just COVID. Here is an opportunity to use it broadly for many other things, to use it for nutrition, to use it for chronic disease. This is an opportunity to expand, and we should leap at that opportunity, whether through Arogya Setu or through other ways.
So you mentioned education. So as a fellow IITian, and this is in the IIT context of the sponsors of this webinar, would it the IIT residential milieu was a fantastic place, or continues to be. So is that going to suffer thanks to remote teaching?
I think that till we come up with a vaccine, speaking specifically of COVID, and then with faster solutions, because our bad luck may be that COVID comes back in a worse fashion. Good luck would be that it comes back in a better fashion, that it's a strain that we can handle because we've had this strain, and we do in fact have herd immunity. But the unlucky thing will be that, yes, the residential thing may be lost. And Jayesh, you're an IITian like I am, in fact, from IIT Bombay. Those wonderful years when I went, it was a 5-year program. Those wonderful 5 years that you spend there and the community that you come with are, of course, both one of the most wonderful parts of your life, but besides that are also an incredible piece of learning, right? We don't just discuss what happened in the physics class that day or the applied mechanics class that day. We also discuss the Sartre book that we read, or whether we believe in Karl Marx or not, or what are the failings of capitalism, or whether the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam is something that we should read or not, right? And that milieu, as you say, must not be lost. We must find a way to do that, right? One of the great books I read, many of you may have read it, Sapiens. The brilliant idea that he came up with was that Homo sapiens is successful, even though as a percentage of brain to body mass, we are smaller than Neanderthals. So Neanderthal brains actually were bigger. Why did they not succeed? He said communication is what made us succeed. And what we have is the communication, the staying together, the living in dormitories together with each other, and the learning from each other, the camaraderie from each other. That is a crucial part of human beings, right? And people have understood that in many, many different ways, right? That's why email was such a successful, quick app. That's why Facebook is such a successful app, right? So, but going back to your question, we must find a way to restore that. It does mean that our healthcare effort must be stronger in coming up with a vaccine that enables us to get together quickly. It must come up with several different drugs. No single drug works on everybody. Even the simplest of things, aspirin. I need aspirin, you need Tylenol, acetaminophen instead of salicylic acid, right? And
Sure,
that's
sure.
not including the corner case of migraines.
So would you, let me ask this question again more pointedly. Would you hazard a guess on the vaccine and the various cures, timeline for those?
I don't think that we can have a vaccine that can be broadly used on the population, is safe and effective for at least one more year. So in my view, any normalcy as we knew it in 2019 cannot return before 2022 as a full year. As a full year. At some point in 2021, we may start to see that.
Okay, thanks, Parag, for that. And you have had the good fortune of advising governments, not just entrepreneurs and innovators, but governments. So you've been advisor to governments in India, in the US, and what's your recommendation under current situation for public policy and regulations?
So I think that there's a lot of things that we've gone into, and I've actually put together with a team. As part of a team, we put together a large number, 47 different recommendations. But if I was to think of the two things that are the most important, thinking about this from one that's common everywhere, but something that I put particularly before Indian governments, and I've talked to this about both to the Manmohan Singh government, as well as I've had a discussion with Prime Minister Modi about this, is that one thing we need really badly is a bond market. And I won't go too long into this, but at the headline level, it is extremely important for efficient borrowing because it lowers the cost of interest to the borrower and it increases the rate of interest received by the lender for any level of risk. So at any given level of risk, if it's a high risk, then high interest, of course, must be paid and must be earned by the lender, right? But what this does is it gives us a system that we do not have efficiently in India. We have a very small bond market. This must grow 1,000-fold. There have been great steps taken recently because one crucial thing, and this is a technical point, but one crucial thing for a bond market to be successful, you must have good, efficient bankruptcy proceedings. A lender must know that there is recourse if they lend. And then what that will do is, Jayesh, it will take you and you will take your money out of something safe and lend it to something that is a little more risky because you are getting a higher rate of interest for it. That is what a bond market does, right? Just as stock prices have different prices relative to their earnings, depending upon the risk and the growth that they offer, similarly, the bond market does that. But it's an alternate and huge availability that we don't have. The second really big point, I have a long list of points, I won't go through them. The second list of points is countries which need capital for investment. And there is no country that does not need capital for investment. Should make it attractive for investors by eliminating taxes, which also eliminates any regulation related to that. The gains made by the draw of capital into the country will be far more. I don't know how many people on this call know that if you are not living in the US, I know some of you on the call on this webinar are in the US, but if you are not a US person and you invest in the US, you buy IBM stock tomorrow or Google stock tomorrow, you sell it at a profit. What is the tax that you owe? Is it 10%? Is it 50%? Is it zero? The answer is zero. The US government is not interested in taxing you. Why? They are happy that you provided capital so that Google or so that Tencent could go public here, or Alibaba could go public here, a Chinese company. That's why I say that. Could go public here. You provided capital to a Chinese company through the US market. That will provide jobs, will provide liquidity, and the taxes that arise from those jobs will exceed the tax that I can get from you, the investor. India needs this investment capital much more. So my biggest single recommendation, other than to help the creation of a bond market, is to simplify or eliminate taxes. I could have more things I could speak on regulation, but time is short. I'm surprised at how much time has passed in this call already.
Yes, indeed. So let's go to one burning question, and that's to address our webinar audience. Amongst them are many talented entrepreneurs on this webinar, many students who are embarking on their careers, some of them thinking entrepreneurship, some of them faculty like me who are wondering at getting their innovations out there. So can you give us some quick suggestions on the key qualities and strengths, especially of the fresh graduates and the young entrepreneurs, to successfully convert their ideas from execution to impact and influence, both commercially as well as perhaps socially?
I think, these are old adages. It's just that as you grow older, you learn that more adages turn out to be true. So at 20, we can't figure out why our parents aren't smarter. At 50, we realize that our parents and the advice they gave us was much smarter than anything we learned anywhere else, right? So the old adage, focus is one of the really important things. Not to try to do too many things, but if you find one thing that does well, keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it. If you really find a problem that you have solved, solve that problem, right? So from our old adages, I would say everyone knows the story of Dronacharya and Arjuna, right? He was giving the archery class and he first asked Yudhishthira, what do you see, when he wanted him to shoot a bird. And Yudhishthira, well, I see the sun, I see the branches, I see the clouds, and so on. He goes student by student, and when he comes to Arjuna, Arjuna says, I see only the eye of the bird. And Arjuna, of course, was the greatest archer because he had that focus, right? It's also important to know when you have conviction, to recognize that when you have looked at the data, you have looked and you have seen a pattern. Pattern recognition is a crucial thing. And there is a little bit of a gift in that, in recognizing pattern recognition. You can do it because you do it over and over again. You can do it because you have an instinct for it. I use a different adage for that. We all also know the story of Lord Nelson. When he was asked to withdraw on his ship, he took his blind eye and put it to the telescope. And he said, I see no order to withdraw. And he charged on regardless. So sometimes there are times that you have to follow and pursue your instinct and go ahead with that. But don't fool yourself. Don't kid yourself that you should not look at the data. Data is really important. It is really available inexpensively and in vast quantity today. So I would say to use that. I think I'd say one more thing which I learned. And I like to believe that I am the originator of this phrase in one version or another. You know, ideas are a dime a dozen, right? हर चवन्नी के लिए एक आइडिया है, बट करने वाला सिर्फ एक करोड़ में है, right? So execution is one in a million. We have lots of ideas and we all say, "Arey, I had that idea too," but doing it is really tough. And the step to execution is really something that separates most people, because that's where you're dealing with the difficult steps that you're going through.
Parag, you mentioned conviction. Yeah. So let me ask you here that I'm sure there must have been a few occasions when you were convinced of a bet you were going to make, an investment you were going to make, an affiliation with a startup, and it didn't work out. So can you tell us about one or two of your best failures and what you learned from them?
I think I have had many failures, and luckily some of them were early in my career, so I learned a great deal from them. I'll tell you one, partly because it contradicts what I've just said. Very early in my career, I met a guy called Bob Swanson, who was 2 years older than me, and his experience was that he was at Citicorp, also a banker. He had left Citicorp to start a company. He started a company and he told me about his company, and I said to myself, this guy is 2 years older than me. He's got a biotechnology company and he's a banker. I would not give me, Parag, any money to start a biotech company. Why am I going to give this guy? He knows less than I am, than I know. I'm at least a chemical engineer with a master's degree, and I worked at Becton Dickinson. So I didn't fund his company. That guy was Bob Swanson, who went on to create Genentech. Genentech, the first creator of a recombinant DNA product, human growth hormone, then the creator of insulin and many products till Herceptin recently, right? A company that has sales of tens of billions of dollars today. The lesson it taught me was the following: that when an idea is new, when a field is new, like biotechnology or Google with its founders, then you need actually a young person not burdened by historical ideas. Experience is actually a liability in such a case, right? And so that was a valuable lesson that I held with me. And then, so now if I see a company which is another company in healthcare where somebody has come up with a digital health solution, if they are not using data, I know they are probably making a mistake. But if it's a completely different way of looking at something, then I'll say, well, maybe they know something that I don't, because I do not have the experience. I do not have the vision set that they have, right? The same thing is true often when there is gamification of things and people come up with a solution with gamification. As a 65-year-old, I do not have the perspective of the 25 or the 30-year-old who knows how that's going to appeal to people differently. And I look to the younger people on my team to advise me on something like that. So what I have learned is go to someone who knows more about that experience set than Parag you do. And I think that the lesson I would part to people is very often you're going to come up with things that you are not the right guy to judge, but you probably know somebody that is the right person to help you with solving that problem, understanding that data.
Great. So, Parag, your interests are very wide. As Ashok mentioned in his opening introduction, tennis to bridge to cricket, Shakespeare to Ghalib, art to astronomy, and so on. Many activities occupy you. So, some hints on time management. How do you break up your time? How do you How does this feed your innovation as well?
I'll answer the question in a different way. I think if I had a regret and if there's a message I had to do, and I did this in Goa, there was an IIT Bombay driven meet, and there were 1,500 of us there. And one thing I said to people was, really take care of your health. Don't let that priority move out. You will regret later, because there are things that you won't be able to do because you did not take care of wellness. So one thing I'll say, wellness is important. The second I'll say is, the other interests in your life, don't neglect them because of the reason to be successful at number one. Find a balance, right? So I've always managed to maintain a little bit of stargazing, a little bit of astronomy. And, in our lifetimes, we have had tremendous joy, right? To see theory after theory of Einstein being proved in practice has been a phenomenal thing for us, right? And so it's been a wonderful thing to see. But I would say, you've got to give time for stuff. Never stop reading. Uh, not just things relevant to your work or your betterment, but read things that are just fun, that are just fiction.
So can I ask you then, what is it that what's the top of your reading list, and how do you actually read now? Are you still a fan of paper, or are you totally electronic?
Jayesh, again, I'm a 65-year-old, so the hardbound book is still the way I go. I normally have 2, 3, 4 books with me at a time. I am enjoying, and I recommend highly, I'm enjoying reading Anarchy. It is one of William Dalrymple's book. Dalrymple has done a phenomenal job of learning Urdu and Persian and telling us a great deal about our own history. One of the things I regret is the education I had didn't tell me much about the Peshwa kingdom and how vast it was. And I'd love to learn about that. In fact, in the entertainment world, I would love to put together a series of TV serials on stuff that happened in Indian history that I don't know, right? What was Ashoka's kingdom really like in the 3rd century BC? Because it spanned Afghanistan, Kalinga, Bengal, down all the way to the southern border, all but the 5 southern states today, right? So I'd love to know more about that history. Dalrymple does a great job of that. But the other things I'm reading right now, I always keep nearby something in poetry, sometimes Shakespeare. Right now, for me, I mentioned this, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. I've taken up bridge again. COVID has been a great helper in helping me play bridge. And so a book called Lemon Sol, which only will be interesting to people who are interested in bridge. By the way, bridge is known to be the one thing that postpones Alzheimer's. So those of you who are 50 or greater and are now thinking about things like Alzheimer's, you should be thinking about that.
Great. Thank you very much, Parag, for those. I have been interspersing some questions from the audience all along, but there are a few in the Q&A box which I would like to ask. We have only a few minutes left. So one of the questions asked is global versus local. I mean, what is your investment advice or investment profiles with respect to global companies or meeting local demand?
I think people should always start companies that deal with local issues, because you're going to be best equipped at dealing with local issues, right? When I look at a project that comes to me, every company is a project. When I look at a project, I look at the experience set of the person that's coming to me. Is this something that they understand really well? That matters more than whether I understand it well or not, because they're always going to know more than I do. And you're always going to know local issues better. And then you can step out and do something globally, right? Look at very, very, very successful companies. They always start something locally, whether it is Starbucks first starting in home Seattle, or Amazon first starting with just books locally in a few locations, right? And then expanding it, right? Now, Amazon is a dominant competitor all over the world. But to get that well, they first got it right in books, then they got it right in their own country, then they got it right elsewhere. So always local first. Solve the problem that you understand really well. Make sure it truly is a pain point for a number of people, then expand it.
Sorry, one last question, Parag, before, because time is running out. What do you think is the next or the current science breakthrough that is going to lead into mass production of tomorrow?
I think the science breakthrough that we have already that should be developed is one of the dreams of manufacturing is the making of one thing for one person, right? So Henry Ford's brilliance was that he got the idea of mass production. And that idea, that assembly line production, has enabled costs to come down, and many people have done that. But today, with where we can, with what computers do for us, we can make one thing so that the shirt that is made for Parag or the shoe that is made for Parag can be a sample of one done extremely cheaply. And I think the opportunity and the science is completely there. The science is completely there, is that we have the ability to do this one for one, right? Before we jump off that particular, I want to use that question to do one more thing if my slides are still visible.
Yes, yes, they are.
To say that COVID is actually just a canary, and the scare that we have had from COVID is a very small scare compared to the problem, much bigger problem of climate change, which we continue to ignore. Climate change is going to lead us to a problem and a situation much worse than what we have today, much worse than what we have today. And we are going to end up with a problem that we will not be able to solve just by sitting at home, because hurricanes will be taking the roofs of our homes, right? What we have seen, we had a cyclone in India recently, you ain't seen nothing yet.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Parag. We have several questions still pending, but I'm sorry the time format doesn't allow us to continue. So I sincerely thank you. And I hand over now to Sushila. Sushila, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This was an extremely interesting session, as I'm all sure everyone believes so. So 20 years ago, Y2K was a game changer, and in many ways, that was what shaped the software industry and the Indian software services industry. And what we heard from you today is, today, 20 years later, we are at another inflection point where you see this as an opportunity just as much as there are issues around it. And you've given us a lot of insights today in terms of what kind of changes it's going to bring about, the opportunities for technology, and how digital is going to be so dominant in our lives going forward. The kinds of new things that are going to emerge and are going to get nudged because of the situation we are in. You talked about the fact that there are three situations that nudge us into making big changes: the change in regulation, technology, and consumer behavior. And then we went on to talk about a very wide range of subjects today. It's been a very interesting talk. You even talked about the fact that we are going to move from looking at diseases to focus on wellness, and how traditional Indian systems are going to have a role to play in all of that. It's been an extremely interesting situation, talk, and Jayesh, I must thank you for having led us and through this whole discussion today, by bringing out so many different aspects of Parag's career and life and interests. There was one big takeaway from today's session, Parag, which is that we need to look at ourselves holistically, care about our health and ourselves, and make sure that our interests are given just as much importance as a career and a work and everything else. So with that, thank you very much once again. This was absolutely an inspiring session. Thanks to both you, Parag and Jayesh. To all of our viewers today, thank you for participating. We've tried our best to answer questions. I'm sure there are many more, and we'll see if we can bring Parag back another time and Jayesh back another time. Please do keep looking at these webinars. We have them. They will all be up. The recording will be up on our YouTube channel. And please look out for our webinars every Saturday this time. With that, thank you very much once again to both of you, Jayesh and Parag. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you.